Joining me on the programme today, we're going to be having Ken Humphreys. Ken is a militant atheist, I suppose you could call him. Doesn't even believe, actually, that Jesus existed. So, certainly doesn't believe in the resurrection. He's going to be in conversation with Tony Costa. He's an American apologist evangelist. He's going to be explaining why he believes we have good reason to believe in the resurrection. A warm welcome to you, Ken. Thanks very much for being with me today.
It's a pleasure, Justin.
Now, the website, Jesus Never Existed, that pretty much says it all in a way, doesn't it? But
it says it all, and it says it at great length.
It's got a wealth of information on there. Certainly, it's a very challenging read. I've been through various articles on it. And we're going to be hearing your reasons for particularly why you would contest this idea that Jesus rose from the dead. It is, if you like, foundational to the Christian faith, the claim that Jesus rose from the dead. If you were able to, to disprove that, then I think you would disprove Christianity fundamentally, and I think Tony Costa, I guess, would probably agree with that. Let's speak to Tony now. Tony, thank you very much for joining us.
It's a pleasure, Justin. Thank you for having me on the show.
Well, it's lovely to have you. You're hail from Canada, and tell me, Tony, your story. Have you sort of had faith from an early age yourself?
Yeah, I come from a Portuguese background, and I was born in a Roman Catholic family that was very devout, very religious, and I shared that type of religious conviction. But the problem with me, Justin, was I really never had this confidence in what I believed. I know what I believed, but I didn't know why I believed what I believed. And I came to have what I would call, I guess, a religious experience at that age in which I came in contact with this person called Jesus of Nazareth, and I believe that he radically changed my life. I've dedicated my life, basically, to figuring out and finding the foundations of my faith. As you pointed out quite rightly, if Jesus did not rise from the dead, then really Christianity has no substance to it.
Tony, tell us, maybe, where are the key things that we should know when it comes to the resurrection of Jesus? If someone came to you and said, believing in Jesus rising from the dead, it's a leap of faith. I can believe maybe Jesus died on the cross, but surely believing in someone rising from the dead, that's just a whole nother ball game, isn't it?
It certainly is, and that's because on a natural level, of course, no one would presuppose that the dead can rise, but the consistent claim of the New Testament writers was that it was God who raised Jesus from the dead.
Ken, you've actually not long ago debated this very subject with Gary Habermas, who is, seen in the world as one of the authorities on
a world
resurrection
specialist on the resurrection, I think, yeah.
Did you enjoy that debate?
Oh, absolutely.
I didn't get a chance to ask you before. It was in front of a student audience, was that right?
Well, student and others, of approximately 1,000, I would thought, the University of Edinburgh, yes.
Fantastic. What was your main contention then yourself against the resurrection?
Well, against the resurrection, of course, Tony has already conceded it offends natural law. If such extraordinary and unusual, unique event had occurred, we need really good evidence. And the consistent claims of New Testament writers, well, it's some sort of evidence, but equally it could simply be the musings of fiction writers and have no evidential value at all. So that is the problem.
Okay. So you're saying we need really rock-tight,
well, yes, we're not debating in colour of oranges. We are saying something here which offends every principle of natural law. It needs really good evidence, yes.
Okay, so, Tony, that's the challenge, I suppose. You've got to have really good evidence if you're going to claim this as being true. How good is your evidence?
Well, if God exists, then then the idea of God raising the dead is definitely possible. If he does not exist, then we have a very difficult time trying to prove that. But by way of evidence, what I would say is that all we do have right now is historical documents that we go by. Most critical historians and scholars, and some of them are very radical critics of the New Testament, concede that there are 5 basic points that we can know about the historical Jesus. 5 basic points that scholars look at when they deal with the historical Jesus. And the 5 points I'd like to enumerate are the following. The first one is the crucifixion. The second one is the honorable burial of Jesus. The third one is the discovery of the empty tomb. The fourth one is the post-mortem appearances of Jesus. And fifthly, the origin of the Christian way. Now, if we look at the crucifixion, what is surprising is that virtually all scholars, historians and New Testament scholars, concede the fact that the crucifixion of Jesus is an indisputable fact.
I know that you have problems from the very beginning on most of this, Ken, because you don't even believe Jesus existed. But obviously we haven't got time to go through everything. But what's your problem then with number one?
Well, let me just say this about the indisputable evidence of crucifixion. We don't actually have that. That is not really what historians say, but they will accept the possibilities of a crucifixion and the fact that we know indisputably crucifixion was a Roman form of execution and torture. So whilst it is not impossible that Jesus was crucified, we don't have actual evidence that that particular Jesus that you are referring to in this debate, the Jesus of Nazareth, was crucified. We don't have it that well tied down. We simply have the probabilistic evidence that crucifixion was a form of execution. Nobody else records that event, that it was Jesus of Nazareth.
So why do you dispute the fact, Ken, that it was Jesus of Nazareth?
No, I don't need to dispute the fact that it was. What we're looking for is evidence that it was. We don't believe that it is so unless we can disprove it. Surely we need evidence that it was Jesus of Nazareth that was crucified.
Right. But why would these critical historians, some quite radical, like Robert Funk, John Dominic Crossan, Gerd Ludemann, why would these scholars who have no investment in Christianity, why would they concede the fact that this was indeed Jesus of Nazareth?
Okay, but what you're claiming there is simply consensus of New Testament scholars.
No, I'm arguing here that the overwhelming number of scholars from diverse backgrounds and academic fields, historians and New Testament scholars, have come to the conclusion that Jesus of Nazareth was put to death by crucifixion.
Okay, I'll give you a brief answer to that question.
Yeah,
the problem we have with New Testament scholarship is that it has been historically dominated by Christians who have been drawn into a study of their faith. Now, whether along the way on they have lost their faith or not, nonetheless, these colleges of Christianity and the universities of Christianity pour out a huge number of students, and of course, most New Testament scholars today still have some affection for the traditional Christianity that they grew up with.
The question here is, what is the criteria that these scholars are using to come to the conclusion that Jesus of Nazareth died on the cross?
I'd say it's the historical faith that they grew up with and the probabilistic chances that for them it was true. It is not a clear-cut case.
You don't believe the internal evidence in the New Testament documents and the external evidence in Greco-Roman Jewish literature has not convinced these scholars that Jesus died on the cross?
I'm sure they've used those sources, but we can all look at the same evidence and reach different conclusions.
Obviously, in this case, you have reached a different conclusion, Ken, but I think for the purposes of our discussion today, we're in a sense going to have to put that discussion to one side. Moving on to your other 4 points there, Tony.
Yeah.
Jesus was buried.
Well, the honorable burial of Jesus is crucial, because what the honorable burial of Jesus tells us is that the location of the tomb of Jesus was known to both enemy and friend alike. And I think this is significant because what it tells us is that the burial place of Jesus was known. When the women disciples went to the tomb, they did not go to a different tomb. They didn't go to the wrong tomb. They knew where he was laid, and therefore this leads us to the next discovery, and that is the discovery of the empty tomb, because the empty tomb discovery is again essential to the premise of the resurrection.
We have points 2 and 3 here: the honourable burial and the empty tomb. If we are looking for, as we agreed, pretty good evidence, damn good evidence for what is an extraordinary event by any standards, we have to say, where is the evidence for these 2 points, the honourable burial and the empty tomb? And unfortunately, we again have to return to the same limited source. Now that is an embarrassment in terms of trying to establish not just a tentative case, but an overwhelming case. That's what we're looking for, something that we can't really argue against. Now, it is interesting, this empty tomb business. It makes me smile now because, of course, we have at least a choice of 3 tombs to choose from. I always think, which tomb are we actually talking about? Because we have the traditional tomb in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. We had the tomb, the so-called garden tomb north of the old city, credited to General Gordon. And now, more recently, we had the third tomb down in East Talpiot that Cameron and company have made a film of. My point about that is, look how ambiguous the evidence is that knowledgeable Christians of all kinds of persuasions can start to locate the tomb wherever they choose. Now that, for me as a skeptic, starts me to think, well, how reliable is this written evidence when the physical evidence is so vague?
Yeah, Tony.
Yeah, I would say that the so-called alleged places of the empty tomb that we have today in the Holy Land, I think the discovery of these various sites did really not come into vogue in Christian history until the 4th century. But what I would say in response to Ken there is, first of all, the empty tomb tradition, again, the evidence that is found for it is found actually in multiple sources within the New Testament documents.
But can I interrupt just a second there, Tony? So you are agreeing that the so-called tombs are all pious fabrications?
Absolutely. I don't think that we know for sure, and the reason why, Ken, we don't know for sure is because the tomb of Jesus was not a place of veneration by the early Christians. The reason why it never became a place of veneration was because it was empty. There was nothing there to venerate.
Okay, I accept your point. Would you also accept that the absence of a tradition could also, logically, be consistent with a fabricated story?
Oh, not at all. Not at all. Again, when scholarship investigates the synoptic accounts and the Johannine account of the empty tomb, it leads them to the conclusion that there is indeed a historical core behind these stories. There are independent sources within those Gospels. Mark is considered the earliest of all the Gospels. That is one source. It is believed that Matthew and Luke used Mark.
I mean, a question for you, Ken. I mean, when you look at this story, do you have some kind of way that it must have played out for you that it just kind of developed over time?
Absolutely, Justin. And of course, Tony has really put us onto that path, whether he intended to or not, in agreeing, as just about every New Testament scholar does, that Mark is the earliest gospel, and also that Matthew and Luke used Mark. Now, that nobody, I don't think, disputes that. And how can they, when 95% of Mark is found in Matthew and 65% of Mark is found in Luke? Now, for me, that is so-called witnesses copying the statements of a so-called eyewitness, none of which holds up. That is really less than convincing. We don't have separate testimony here. We have undeniable evidence of later writers copying the work of earlier writers. Now, that is, to answer your question, that is demonstrably showing how the story developed. The authors of Matthew and Luke took Mark's manuscript and added bits to it. We're not building up here evidence of independent testimony or eyewitness testimony. We're building up evidence of the accretion of an ever more elaborate story.
Well, what do you say to that?
I would disagree with that. First of all, as I pointed out earlier, Mark is a separate independent source. Yes, Matthew and Luke adopted Mark in various places, but that's not to say that Matthew and Luke themselves, they have their own special material that scholars refer to as M and L, of course. And the Johannine Gospel, the fourth Gospel, is also considered an independent source. When we look at the Gospel accounts of the discovery of the empty tomb, you have women disciples coming to the tomb, which in the first century setting was considered unimaginable to have women who had no legal status, no legal witness whatsoever, bearing witness to the empty tomb of Jesus. It's like shooting yourself in the foot. Now, the fact that the gospel writers mentioned the women as the discoverers of the empty tomb, I think, shows that we have a ring of authenticity here.
Well, okay, the point is often made about the testimony of the women. Yes, that's a standard point, I accept. Except that it doesn't end there. Of course, the testimony of women was acceptable when there were no male testimonies. For example, you can find that used by the writer Josephus. He uses female testimony when he's talking about what happened at Masada. So when push comes to shove, the testimony of women was acceptable.
Isn't the point surely that if you're claiming it was a fabrication, Ken, they wouldn't have opted for women in the first place? I mean, isn't that the whole point?
Okay, we have to unwrap this to another level, okay? Because, yes, there is a point here that needs answering, right? Now, Tony, as you will know, as I do, 1 Corinthians 15 very well, Paul does not there, in his list of appearances, refer to women.
No, he doesn't.
He doesn't. So there's a first anomaly. And if you look at each of the independent gospels, as you call them, well, there is no consistency in this appearance of women. If you look at the Gospel of Luke, it's more than 4. If we look at the Gospel of Mark, it's 3. If we look at the Gospel of Matthew, it's 2. If we look at the Gospel of John, it's 1. And in Paul's writings, we have none. Now,
well, let me add,
how inconsistent can you be?
You raise a very interesting point. The reason why Paul does not mention the women in his Corinthian letter is because he is well aware that his Corinthian community will not accept his testimony. Paul is dealing with skeptics in the Corinthian church. He says in 15 verse 12 that, why do some of you say there is no resurrection of the dead? His whole point is a polemic. He's trying to show them that the resurrection of Jesus is true and that it is fundamental to the Christian faith.
All right, let me come back to you on that, Tony. If Paul is being a politician and thinking on his feet, can you still maintain that this creed is this early document passed on by the apostles? Are you saying that he's modified the documents when he gets down to Corinth?
Well, he certainly has modified it in the sense that he's added himself to it. He's added his own experience of meeting the risen Christ.
And taken the women out.
But he leaves the women out deliberately because of his Corinthian audience. He's well aware that they would dispute him on that fact, on that point, because as in Judaism, so in Corinth, women had no legal standing as witnesses.
So that does suggest we have to start viewing these documents with an awareness of political realities.
Well, we have to put them in their cultural context. They didn't come out of a vacuum.
Okay, it does rather weaken the basis on which we're claiming incontrovertible evidence, if that's so.
If I could, as it were, add to what Tony's saying, Ken, some say that Paul, being so close, if you like, in time to these writings, to the Corinthians, etc., to the death and resurrection of Jesus, it shows that this was not some kind of idea that developed over some time, became legendary, etc. This was something that Christians were talking about, saying was part of their creedal faith from the very earliest times, and so it seems a very short time in which this legend must have had to have sprung up compared to the normal time that legends do tend to do that.
Okay, a response to that. Whether this statement in 1 Corinthians 15 is a creedal statement, well, I will accept that. It certainly reads that way. It does seem as if it's a creedal statement. And why I would say it certainly looks that way in particular is because the verses that lead into that statement and the ones that lead out from it follow fairly consistency. In other words, you could take that creedal statement out and the document still reads fairly reasonably. Now, there's an alternative to the idea that this is a very early creedal statement and that it is a later interpolation. And why I would say that's the more likely is because when on earth do you start having creeds? When, I'd say, there is a need to resolve difficulties within the community of Christians. I don't dispute that this is a creed we are talking about. The issue really is, when did this creed become part of 1 Corinthians? Now, unfortunately, we do not have any original documents. We do not have anything written by Paul or his scribe from the 1st century or whenever they were written. The earliest ones, as you will know, they're at the beginning of the 3rd century where we have real evidence of these documents. Now,
papyrus.
Absolutely. Now, that allows plenty of time for the insertion of a creed within an existing document. Now, the issue then becomes, what is the more likely case, the more probabilistic case, that this document was written as is within 5 years, as you say, or 3 years, or whatever it is, of the crucifixion, or this creed was entered into the document in order to resolve inter-church conflict. And I'd say the latter is the more probabilistic because that's precisely the pattern whereby we derive other creeds later on in Christian history, such as the Nicene Creed. It resolved earlier disputes in a definitive way by saying, this is what we believe. Now, it seems very inconsistent or very unconvincing that this creed, which you accept that Paul is willy-nilly amends if politics favours that, this creed is early rather than late. I think it's unlikely, particularly because it doesn't even agree with what goes in the Gospels.
That's interesting. We're going to allow Tony to pick up on that particular assertion. You're listening to Unbelievable. We're talking about the resurrection. Did it really happen? Atheist Ken Humphreys is with me, and on the line, Tony Costa, evangelist and apologist from Canada. Let's move on to number 4 in your list of 5 here.
Well, the fourth point here is the post-mortem appearances. That is that Jesus appeared to individuals, to groups of people. He appeared to skeptics, to enemies in different locations, in different situations. And whether you want to call them hallucinatory, whatever you want to call them, the fact of the matter is that these disciples did experience appearances of the risen Jesus. Scholarship keeps asserting historical reliability here, a core that shows that there was such a thing as appearances. You cannot avoid the fact that the disciples did experience something.
Maybe, or maybe somebody, various scribes, have written their holy books with that description as they made them of these characters in their story. I mean, it's rather interesting. If we look at the gospel trajectory of how these stories grew, we can see the evolution of an idea here. Whatever your quoted authorities are saying, that would be my point. There seems to be the evolution of a story here.
I don't sense that there is this evolution of a myth or a fable taking place here.
Does this link into your 5th point, Tony,
which
is the emergence of the Christian way?
It does, Justin. The Christian faith did not begin with the teachings of Jesus. It did not begin by the life of Jesus. What started the Christian movement off was the proclamation that God raised Jesus from the dead. There is no other origin.
Well, with respect, I think there is. With that chain of logic, we arrive at the point that's rather interesting in the sense that it is little more than saying Christianity succeeded because of its success. In other words, we have won, we have become the biggest religion, we are the official religion of the Roman Empire. That is itself proof that our foundational doctrines were correct. Now, the problem with that logic is that it could be applied equally well to any other successful organization, including Islam. So the fact that Christianity triumphs is not an argument in favor of evidence of the truth for their faith.
Something fundamental you may be forgetting here. In the context of first century Judaism, the whole idea of a crucified Messiah, it was a contradiction in terms, because why would any Jew want to believe that their Messiah had been crucified, accursed by God, unless something transformative happened?
Indeed. I'll agree that something very big had to happen to cause Christianity to emerge from the body of main Judaism. And I'll give you what that big thing was. It was 3 major conflicts with the Roman Empire, which led to the destruction of the temple economy, the destruction of traditional Judaism, and the wiping of Judea off the map of the Roman Empire.
Okay.
That was the cataclysm that gave birth to Christianity.
The problem with that is that Christianity was already a force to be reckoned with prior to AD 70. Christians were already found in Rome before the destruction of the temple, and so I don't think those points are historically verifiable. I don't think they're proven. I think the fact of the matter is the Christian faith mushroomed.
Tony, you will, I think, agree with me that once we move earlier than Constantine and the official religion, we move into an increasingly foggy environment in terms of sources and evidence that we can really trust. The sources get fewer, they get contradictory. We're in a period of church conflict where there's many contending factions, and though there are wild claims made for this period, very few of them can be borne out. One that has particularly attracted my interest for a long while now is this idea of the persecution of early Christians. Really, to substantiate that there was serious wholesale persecution of the early Christians, and therefore somehow their suffering was evidence of the truth of their faith. That whole area is fraught with problems.
Well, I would say that the amount of evidence we have may not be as numerous as we would have, for instance, for the New Testament documents themselves. I think when we look at those documents, I mean, for instance, if you look at the letter of Pliny to the Emperor Trajan, he talks about the interrogation of Christians and how he interrogates them, and if they refuse to burn incense to the emperor and confess the emperor as Lord, they're put on trial and then they're summarily executed. I think we're able to glean out of these materials, even if they're not as massive as the early New Testament documents are. I think we're able to glean out of them the fact that there was indeed real persecution.
But you see, against that, I would have to say we've got like the church father Origen in Alexandria, who in the middle of the 3rd century says the number of Christian martyrs is actually very few and can be easily counted.
Yes.
Now, now that doesn't, to me, and bear in mind we're trying to look for really convincing evidence, that doesn't to me sound like massive whole-scale persecution.
Right. But I think we're still, notwithstanding the fact that, yes, Origen does mention that, I think a case can be made that there was, even the burning of Rome and Nero blaming this on the Christians, I think demonstrates that such persecution did take place.
Is it fair, though, to say, Ken, that compared to most scholars, you seem to require far more evidence than most people are happy to have when it comes to historical evidence of 2,000 years ago?
You're making a reasonable point there, so let me clarify that. Yes, if we have a single reference in one source to somebody, let's say, the freedman of Emperor Claudius being called Pallas, one reference, and I'll accept it's probably true. The problem with accepting Jesus and his merry men on that same basis is that somebody gains. There is an axe to grind here. There is a religion that is built upon this. That's the reason why we have to say we need a little bit more than Paul saying he was a persecutor.
I think that the basic question here is really one of a worldview. I think what we have here is a clash of worldviews. Ken is proceeding forth from a worldview that there is no God, and therefore, if there is no God, then it follows that there can be no breaks into the natural order of things. There's no miracles. I, on the other hand, hold that there is a God, and I believe that the creator of the universe, if he's able to create the universe, he's able to raise someone from the dead.
Thank you so much for joining us on the program today, Tony. Ken, thank you for all your tough questions and just bringing the skeptic's point of view to the program today. And thank you for joining me both on the program today, gentlemen.
Thank you, Justin. Thank you, Tony.
Thank you, Ken.
It's been a really great spirited discussion here in the studio.
You're unbelievable.